I think it's scary at times because you really are potentially influencing the way hundreds of millions of people think a month.
Yair, Livne, thank you so much for joining me. How are you?
All right, you're good. How are you?
Wonderful. Where are you calling from right now?
I'm in Palo Alto.
You're in Palo Alto, and I have to congratulate you on a pretty big transition right after many years at Quora. Also, quite a few years, I believe 4 years of VP of product. You've recently finished your service there. And you're onto some different things, and I'd love to chat about your experience with Quora and some of the really interesting things that you've done, both that are mainstream today, but also that weren't necessarily mainstream back when you were working on them. But I'd like to start all the way back, going back to Stanford. You're doing your PhD over there in economics, and you're working on some really interesting things that I just love, both matching theory and political economy. Tell me a little bit about yourself and what led you to do that research at Stanford.
Yeah, a great question. So I've been curious about economics for years. Kind of before coming to Stanford, I was doing my BA and master's at the Hebrew U in Jerusalem, and was mixing math and econ throughout. And I was really interested in this kind of intersection where the theory and kind of the beauty of mathematics can be applied to real world problems. Maybe like the epitome of that is auction theory, which won the Nobel Prize a few weeks ago. So that was kind
Yes,
of a motivating kind of energy coming in.
I
And
actually got a chance to be in quite a few lectures by Milgram this past year, and I have to say that I didn't understand much, but it was still fascinating nevertheless.
yeah, I was in a reading group with him for kind of a couple of years, and it was really fascinating to kind of see him like think and kind of appreciate his point of view on the world. It's extraordinary.
So,
Yeah,
so, so continue about your research. Yeah.
yeah. Anyway, so I got curious. What other kind of beautiful mathematic applications can be used to understand the world or maybe improve the world? And kind of matching markets was a really fascinating thing. It was kind of blowing up within economics at the time. People were innovating on matching theory to do things like kidney donations and matching kids to schools in a really efficient way. And some of those kind of techniques were actually implemented then in the kidney donation market, or in actual school systems like in Boston and New York, which were changing how they were running things using economic theory and with prominent economists as kind of the people planning these systems. So that was kind of how I got pulled into this area.
So I have to spend some time talking about the beauty of mathematics, and enlighten both myself and a lot of my viewers that aren't necessarily leaning into the mathematical world. I am, but I know a lot of my friends who are excited about innovation aren't leaning there. How does mathematics play a role into our lives, whether it's matching theory or political economy? I'd love to really understand this world a little bit better and show some of the excitement.
Yeah, so for me, a lot of it comes from, and I think this is kind of the modern way to view economics, is from incentives. So if you can describe with a little bit of math, it doesn't need to be super sophisticated, what people's preferences are and what kind of outcomes they prefer, then you can model the world again with fairly simple primitives and use this description of incentives to predict behavior. And if you can predict behavior, then you can go one step higher and describe what kind of systems would actually push for better behavior on the part of the economic agents. So in the case of, let's say, school choice, if people have preferences over schools and they want to be matched with a specific school for their kid, and that may involve many different types of considerations, like what are your the other kids in the family, are they going already to schools in the system, what kind of focus areas does that school have, and what is that a good match for their child or not, how close is the school to where they live, and kind of model all of that out. And again, this is not rocket science. This is kind of fairly simple ways of creating kind of lists of preferences. then you can think of, okay, if I ask people and have incentives that are aligned in the sense that the system will actually respect your preferences and give you the best outcome for the preferences you stated, then you can think of designing these systems in a way where matching is quote unquote optimal, and you can get the best outcomes for the most, like the largest amount of people. So that's, for me, really neat thing where you can take mathematical models and kind of solve them in a way which generate better outcomes for people, in their real lives on the things that matter most to them.
100%. And I have to say that I've been getting exposed to the process of residency and doctors, the people in medical school that are getting there. And on one hand, it seems, yes, matching is a problem. It's a little bit longer. Sometimes it's not ideal. But then when you meet the person that's actually going through that process, and this is not a life-threatening situation, right? Like kidney donations or stuff like that, but you can still see the impact of what mathematics and algorithms can do to help ease the process, let alone save lives. That is beautiful, as you mentioned. That is beautiful mathematics, and I'm extremely excited to continue my studies and get to those levels. And then, what about the political economy? How does math play into politics and what's happening
So fun
there?
fact there is I got pulled into it through my wife, who was also doing a PhD at Stanford at the same time, and she was in the political science department, but actually had a very similar background from kind of a game theory and mathematics perspective. And we were both kind of curious. This is like, again, really good timing, because we were doing this kind of pre-Arab Spring, but we got really curious on this topic of protest, especially protests in authoritarian regimes. So these are people who are taking a big chance and risking their lives and going to voice, their concerns or their objections to the regime under the threat of, arrest or execution. And kind of why are they doing that? What kind of dynamics contribute to them taking that chance? What are they looking to get out of it? And so we were using a kind of a mixed approach of both looking at empirical data, but also building a mathematical model that would try to explain under what conditions would people actually take that chance, and again, take on a meaningful cost to get an outcome. And that outcome is political. And so kind of reached a model where, the economic conditions were often a strong determinant of when protests might happen and what's the probability of that protest actually having an impact. And again, the timing was really opportune because we were doing this just before the kind of Arab Spring, where we saw this actually play out with, many regimes being toppled or at least shaken by mass protest movements, something that wasn't seen for basically decades. So when we were originally taking on this research, it was kind of out of like vogue to study protests, because it was like, this never happens or this isn't meaningful. And then a year or two later, we saw all this unfold. So it was really a kind of a fun experience to be thinking about these problems.
So Yair, you're working on these mathematical models. You're thinking about all this, and all of a sudden the Arab Springs happens, and you're watching this, and I have to get into the perspective that you're at. I believe it's like 2010, 2011, right? How does this all play out? Are you surprised? Do you anticipate? Does this research take on a greater role? What happens there?
Yeah, so we definitely were surprised. Again, this was not something that we had seen since probably, the fall of the Soviet Union, where people were kind of toppling regimes by going out into the streets. So it was a shock. I mean, it was kind of, very relevant, or like eerily similar to what the dynamics we described in our papers, because ultimately the logic was kind of very simple. If things get kind of bad enough from an economic perspective, or people are desperate enough, they'll take that chance. That was like the heart of the model, but really connecting it to like the empirics and actually kind of being able to quote unquote predict this was the neat part of the research. And so it was both surprising but very kind of consistent in the same at the same time. And I kind of both my wife and I were in the process of kind of leaving academia, but for the professor we were working with in the political science department, this was a very good boost for her career.
Unbelievable. And so you're at that point, you're leaving academia, and you have a series of different experiences throughout your professional career leading up to your job at Quora. Now, I know Quora as this beautiful website that I go to answer all of the relevant and irrelevant questions that I may have. But walk me through a little bit your life path that led to being VP of product at such an awesome company.
Yeah, so it may seem random, but I think there is a thread connecting everything, or at least I'd like to believe so. Uh, so for me, kind of what I've enjoyed or what I've been attracted to is how do we kind of again use kind of math or logic to unlock a lot of value, and that's something that's kind of always driven me, or I've been passionate about. And with Quora, as an economist, this was actually a fascinating thing to dive into because you can think about Quora. And I think this is true of knowledge more generally as a market. There are people who need certain answers to certain questions. Those may be very important or trivial. That's all fine. And there are other people in the world who know the answers to those. And kind of how do you connect the two sides of this market? And how do you unlock value? And how do you create the right incentives for people to be kind of sharing that online in a public way? That was like the key question that motivated me. And actually, my first project that I got put on was we had what a concept at the time that we later kind of deprecated called Quora credits, which was a way for people to accumulate kind of virtual money. This is kind of pre-Bitcoin, everything about virtual money. So accumulate this kind of point system and be able to spend it by asking people directly for their answers on a question. So you basically got an ability to kind of buy someone's attention by sending them a notification and an email saying, "Hey, can you answer this question?" And so each person had kind of a dynamic price of how much is their attention worth, and that was based on supply and demand dynamics in the marketplace. And again, if you were a good member of the community and you had supplied value yourself, then you were able to kind of utilize that and kind of get value or get knowledge out of somebody else's head. That was like kind of a beautiful concept to me and something that really pulled me into working for the company.
Wow. So, a marketplace of knowledge in an age of misinformation, you're VP of product, I believe all the way back from 2016, right? You're saying what is happening with the election and when I look on social media and those sorts of areas, it's very hard for me not to be pessimistic about where we're headed with misinformation and it's almost like a promise to myself that I'll only really accept knowledge when I see it, cross-sectioning from various sources, and I take pride in that. But how do you, as VP of product, approach this, mentality that we have a real issue on our hands and it's growing exponentially, right? I mean, it's getting out of control.
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think for us, like, well, we were actually very kind of, in some sense, validated by all this happening. This kind of sounds ironic, but we at that point had been worried about kind of misinformation or just generally what's true or not for many years. For us, like our mission is to share and grow the world's knowledge. And by that, we mean real knowledge that is useful to people. Misinformation is something that undermines, as you were saying, people's trust and knowledge. So for us, it was a existential threat if, the platform can be manipulated into, showing or prominently or spreading information that's not actually true. That undermines trust in the platform. That reduces the incentives for people to search for knowledge. And because of these marketplace dynamics I was describing, it also reduces the incentives of good people to actually share the right information, because there's all this other junk out there that might drown out what they are saying or what they are sharing. So for us, we were thinking about this problem kind of years earlier. One of kind of the key moments for me in that journey was we had a digest email, or still have a digest email, which was one of the more popular kind of emails out there that go out and to hundreds of millions of people and has personalized information for them. Something we had invested a lot in, and there was, I believe this was in 2014 or 2015, we had sent out to, if I remember correctly, hundreds of thousands or a few million people an answer at the top of their email that had basically kind of a 9/11 conspiracy theory content in it, like featured prominently. And that was like a real wake-up moment of, hey, if we're approaching this purely algorithmically with all these algorithms that try to understand what people like, but we do this on the base of fairly kind of shallow signals like clicks and upvotes, we may fall into these traps. And we really have to put in some guardrails and make sure that we don't let that kind of, quote unquote, information to take over. And so we had been thinking about this for years before the election. And for us, kind of seeing the rest of the industry suddenly realize, hey, there's a massive kind of problem here. and we should start being a lot more careful about free speech, quote unquote, was again validating in some sense because we had been working on this for years.
Wow, that's a lot of responsibility, isn't it?
Uh,
To sit in that chair and understand that the things that you're working on are at the core of information.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's scary at times because you really are potentially influencing the way hundreds of millions of people think a month, and that those subtle nudges towards believing things that aren't true are risky from a political perspective, social stability perspective, medical advice, like all these areas are hyper important to people's lives, and if you're pushing the wrong stuff out there, that is the opposite of our mission. That is dangerous, and so that's kind of a fear or a concern. Again, we were occupied with for a long time, and it's just to call out and be kind of a little charitable to other platforms. This is a really kind of tricky area. You don't want to. It's very hard to be the voice of kind of truth and be an arbiter of, hey, every little fact. We're talking about millions and millions of answers a week. What's true or not? Nobody can kind of sift through that and make a decision. You even saw this with the pandemic, where the early information that the most credible agencies were pushing out was actually false. And at that time, it was very hard to kind of again make that call. So you need to strike this balance of allowing debate and allowing enough spectrum of views to kind of have its fight out there and kind of have that evolution of ideas, but at the same time, the stuff that's kind of intentionally false or deliberately misleading or is kind of the conspiracy theory realm, have a really hard line there and have the mechanisms in place where you can squash that when it arises.
So it's really unfair that I'm asking you this when we have literally a minute and a half to the interview. But where are we headed? What needs to happen so that when as I watch my niece, who is 6 years old, as she grows up and she gets more into social media and she's so curious, how can I help her? How can the world help her gain curiosity in the right way?
Yeah, I think that's a really key question, and I think that this is a really interesting intersection of regulation, kind of corporate responsibility on the side of platforms, and frankly, a lot more I think debate that needs to happen there. So I don't have like a magic bullet, but I do think platforms need to spend a lot more thought and time about kind of striking that balance and making sure their algorithms don't kind of trend or have these feedback loops that end up in these places where people become convinced of flat earth theories for real because of like some rabbit hole they went down through in YouTube. So I honestly think that the right solution is some regulation, potentially not a massive amount, but a lot more kind of corporate effort to kind of squash these pockets of the internet that are really dangerous.
Right, and we've obviously seen the sensitivity behind this, the intersection between regulation and private companies and what's happening, especially as we've seen in the most recent election, some of Twitter's actions, some of Facebook's actions that, even a single action could like flagging a comment by an official in the White House as something that may be not correct. That stirs up some very meaningful conversations about the foundation of what is the responsibility of these private companies, as well as what is the responsibility for their own company, but also for the citizens and for the integrity of a free and fair election or democracy. Yair, I want to thank you for being so kind with your time and so generous. I could go on this for another 2 hours because everything that we've touched here is so fascinating and so remarkable. So thank you for sharing that with me. Before we leave, I have to ask you for 3 words that you would use to describe yourself.
Optimistic, persistent, and curious.
So after all of that, optimistic, persistent, and curious, I just love it. Thank you so much, Yair. This was just wonderful. Toda rabba.
Thank you so much.